Yeah, I'll get this.
Yeah.
It's that moment.
No, that's it.
So today we've got Dean Luke and Gustavo Torrens as part of the Natural Resource Governance Program on property rights and domestication. Gustavo's going to kick it off, but Dean's here too, and then we open it up.
Cool. So, okay, such a pleasure to be here. It was a long trip from Wiley Hall. You should appreciate that. Well, okay, Lee already said, so this is a joint project with Dean Luke. Let me briefly tell you what we are doing. So it's the first thing is this is kind of a part of a broader project on the economics of domestication. So it's, what are the goals of this broader project? So we want to understand the economic forces behind the domestication process. We would also like to understand the spatial and temporal diffusion of domestication, right? And from my perspective, the most interesting part is to understand the connection between domestications and the development of economic institutions, in particular property rights and markets. Okay. So the paper that you read is essentially just kind of the kickoff of this research agenda, and it's especially prepared for a special issue in honor of Joran Barzel for the Journal of Institutional Economics. That's why you see that we are overstressing the connection with Barzel in some parts of the paper. Okay? So just a brief summary of what we did in this paper. So first of all, we intensively review the available literature on domestication. Okay, and essentially there are two big sources of researchers that have been working on domestication. So the first one is genetics. So people in genetics, they use genetic code comparisons to figure out the differences between domesticated versions and wild ancestors of those domesticated versions. So that's very important evidence. But the bulk of the evidence is coming from the work of archaeologists and anthropologists that essentially they have been intensively working on domestication, and essentially there are three ways in which they try to identify what was the process of domestication. Essentially, they study morphological changes in the animals, right? So especially in the bones of the animals. They also study some evidence of herd management. So the way that herds are managed in hunter-gatherer societies or domesticated herds are very different. So that's also a signal of domestication. And finally, another important signal of domestication is the appearance of a species in a non-native habitat. Okay? So far, economists essentially almost no interest in the topic at all. So we reviewed a lot of literature, we didn't find much. Okay, so if the economic approach wouldn't be very valuable, that wouldn't be a problem essentially. But what we claim in this paper is that there is value added on bringing some tools from economics to the study of domestication. Okay, and just essentially what we try to convince you is that there are essentially three tools that we can bring from economics and to the study of domestication. The first one is economics of property rights, and there the connection with ourselves is obvious. Okay, so just to give you an example. So usually wild populations are governed by relatively weak property rights regimes. Okay, so common property, not well-defined property rights, not well-enforced property rights. Kind of the opposite happened with domesticated populations. Usually you have kind of a relatively well-defined and relatively well-enforced regimes of private ownership. Okay, so that's something interesting to explore. The other thing is that we have a huge literature in economics on the economics of renewable resources. Okay, so that could add value to the study of domestication. Okay, just to give you a hint of in which sense, well, essentially you can think the domestication process as a move from natural selection to economic selection, and essentially the dynamic of this renewable resource will be affected because of this switch. Okay? And the final thing that I would like to emphasize that I believe evolutionary economics could also bring something very, very interesting here. And I will not expand more, but let me tell you exactly how evolutionary economics could be useful. Okay. In 1 minute, let me describe what we did in the last part of the paper. Essentially, we illustrate these ideas with a basic model. Okay? It's a simple model of domestication. We start with the hunter-gatherer groups just hunting a wild population, and at some point there is an innovation in hunting strategies. So essentially, somehow now you can confine animals and then slaughter those confined animals. Okay? So it's just an innovation in the hunting strategies. The key thing here is that the confinement cost will be different depending on the types of animals. And essentially it would be lower for more docile animals and higher for more aggressive animals. And that's essentially trigger the whole process. Because now, in the long run, essentially you start killing a higher fraction of aggressive animals from your confined population and keeping the dociles. You are not doing that because you have in mind the domestication of the animals. You just do it because it's a better hunting strategy, and then in the long run you end up essentially with only docile animals. Okay, so essentially you generate this domestication event, which is not the explicit goal of anybody. So there is no kind of fully rational expectation. There are costs and benefits, but essentially I was just thinking in one generation, and this triggered the process after many, many generations of domestication. Okay? So we have kind of many cool pictures to show you, but I will allow, we'll just keep just this picture. So this is so these are the global accumulations of 16 major domestic animals over time. Okay, so you can see how this essentially happened over time, and I can also I like this better because these do exactly the same thing, but separated in the two most important areas in which domestication started: the Near East and Asia. So you can see what happened there. So essentially, there is a lot of accumulation of domestication in some particular places, and then diffusion from those places. Okay. Good. So I think I took a little bit more.
Okay, let's start off. Nick.
So I like this a lot. In fact, I mean, the whole time I was reading dem sets kept coming to mind, and you show a good evolution of, okay, here's the costs and what needs to kind of overcome it. But what kind of was missing was the political nature. Is the political structure of these hunting and gathering societies raising any transaction costs, right? In other words, could there be more to this? I mean, can you tell that story is a harder question, I mean, given this is a long, long time ago. But, I mean, what would change, maybe another question that could come from this, what would change in your model with the rise of, say, the state, right? I'm looking at an interesting paper I'm working on the taboo on pork in ancient Egypt. And, the structure really comes from the political push for cattle, which they raided the lands there. So I'm wondering if there are political costs that also maybe need to be incorporated more into your model.
Yep. So
just a quick feedback on that. I mean, so Jim Scott's new-ish-ist book addresses this a little bit, right? So I don't love everything about the book, but mostly because it's less academic and more like, as I ease into retirement, I thought I'd write this cool book on something I'm interested in. May we all have the opportunity to do that, because it is actually like a fascinating and lovely read. But he starts to wrestle with some of these political implications. For him, it is a question specifically of the rise of the state, but also looks at the disaggregation of some of these practices across different areas, right? So within Asia, for example.
So should I jump? Okay, so it's, well, of course, I totally agree that this is kind of a very interesting thing. The issue that I would start this entangling is, are we talking about that we think that there is a political process, a political change required to have domestication, or the other way? Okay, so we are thinking that domestication is a precondition to have some kind of a more sophisticated political system or even a state. Okay, so I think I know I could be wrong, but my read is the second view has been more emphasized. No? You need domestications of animals and plants in order to do the transition from a hunter-gatherer society essentially to an agricultural society, and then you start having more complex property regimes, a more complex state, so on and so forth. And I think most likely the book goes in that direction.
He's arguing the opposite, right?
He's arguing the opposite. Okay, so that would be interesting, closer to essentially to our project, because we want to understand the domestication process in itself rather than the consequences of domestication. Okay.
So domestication of
Okay.
both animals and the state makes sheep
Okay.
stupider and make us stupider. Right?
Okay. Yes. So
We
connect.
should
Yeah.
continue to be hunter-gatherers if you are.
Correct. So connected with this idea, there is also a discussion among evolutionary biologists on the self-domestication of the human species. Okay. So which it's something that we did not touch here, but it's something that in our kind of bigger project we should consider at some point. Okay. So it's yes, you can think. Let me tell you a little bit about what I know about this thing. Okay. So it's some biologists before Darwin, they started considering this idea of self-domestication. Okay, then Darwin considered the issue, but at some point says, "Well, no, I'm not convinced that this is something's okay." And then some evolutionary biologists in modern times now they are kind of reviving the idea of self-domestication. Okay, the self-domestication process is very different because it's kind of there is no domesticator, essentially. Okay, so there is no active agent domesticating the species. The species is essentially evolving to a more docile version. Okay, so again, in the case of animals, I think it's that issue is little bit less of an issue because essentially what you have is humans doing something with white populations and then started doing something else when they can essentially confine and control those populations. Okay.
And I guess before you go down the rabbit hole, I don't know that I see it as a damning problem with the paper.
Yeah.
I just echo the critique that the political seems to be missing.
Yep.
Right. So whether that's a paragraph or a footnote or we are not addressing this and moving forward, but I think there are complex political processes that are overshadowing this, and to the extent that they impact the cost calculus that you're discussing, I think that's important, right? So do they change the parameters?
Correct.
And I guess where I'm going with this is what's the underlying property rights of like the habitat that you have it in the model, right? Like I think this area has lots of like roving bandits going around, right? How secure is the property rights that they're domesticating the animal in the first place? Is there a cost of protection? So it seems like there's got to be more than just is it an aggressive and docile animal. I mean that's important.
Correct.
Yeah.
So look, the starting point, and you can jump then.
Yeah.
If you want. So the starting point is, I think, a hunter-gatherer group that essentially collectively defend a hunting territory, let's say, okay? Mm-hmm. And then essentially something happened in the way they hunt, okay? And then yes, you end up essentially wiping out the aggressive ones and keeping a confined docile population. That's what happened in the model, okay? So, so coming back to the potential political issues, there are some papers that have studied how you convert common property into private property, and they use notions from economics of conflict to do that. Okay, so that may apply to this problem. Okay, we didn't do it, but it's possible. So what we wanted to do is to stress this idea that for economic reasons, you start selectively slaughtering different types, which essentially generates the process, okay? But I totally understand that it could be, so the dynamic of the group, the hunter-gatherers, could affect the incentives to do this, okay? No doubt about it, okay? So maybe we even discussed at some point something like a very long-run natural resource curse, okay? So you are in an environment in which, let's say, it's very easy for you with the other, so transaction costs in the hunter-gatherer societies are very low, the political transaction costs, so you keep hunting, you never switch, and then, okay, that's good in the short run, but at some point, essentially, you never enter in the good domestication path. So something like that could be possible. So it's and it could be interesting, and it could be triggered by some environmental issues, but also some organizational or institutional issues within the hunter-gatherer loop. Okay. Sorry.
Yeah. Gustavo was right to point out that the model assumes that the hunter-gatherer owns the habitat.
Okay. So yeah.
In some sort of territorial defensive way. One thing I really like about this strand of thought is that you can, I think this is the way I interpret it, You can think of different hunter-gatherer societies having different political organizations, which they definitely did. So the bison hunters were pretty big groups compared to the jackrabbit hunters in Utah, for example. And which kind of group would be more sort of pre-positioned, if you will, or have a lower cost of converting a wild into a domestic? And one place, so I think one thing we can do is look a little bit at the structure of hunter-gatherer societies, get a sense of how they differ, maybe what we might think they would be like in the Near East and Asia, given the habitat and so forth. And also a very good place to look at this more carefully is with reindeer and caribou, where you have reindeer herders and you have reindeer hunters, caribou hunters. So some people did not switch, they still hunt caribou, same animal, and the geography may have impacted not only the character of the animals, the behavior of them, changing the ease of catching them and so forth. And it may be that the structure of the groups, we'll call it the political structure of the groups, which again, we're just assuming the group is a big, perfectly acting, rational blob, if you will, with no political costs. So I really like that line of inquiry, and you can certainly do that, I think.
Yep, I think
Yeah,
it's doable. Yep.
Yeah, I've got a related point to what's going on. First, I think you should look at North and Thomas had some work in the 70s on the Neolithic Revolution. And I'm not sure you can look at the domestication of animals separately from, domestic, or rather, when you go from hunting and gathering, you also went to changing seeds. So you had genetic changes in seeds and in breeds. But people got less healthy when you went from hunter-gatherer society to domesticated society. There's pretty strong evidence on this. They got shorter, disease rates went up, but they lived longer. And they lived longer because they didn't die of violent death so much. So that one reason, this gets at the political economy, one reason for bunching together was for defense. So you could defend yourself and your herd, but then you defended your crops and your cattle. But bunching up means you're also living with your wastes. So one reason hunting and gathering societies seemingly were healthy is that, one, it's argued they had a very high protein diet, not so many grains, and they moved away from their wastes, which was a main thing of people bunching together, and limited how much people could bunch together. So, but I'm just sort of thinking that you might want to look at the complementarity, and I think Dean's point is looking at the political economy of these hunting-gathering societies, but the complementarity and the endowments of how much hunting they did and how much gathering they did and how much storage they did of seeds and berries and so on. If, like you said, jackrabbits and squirrels aren't great compared to bison in terms of, and the tallest Native Americans, I think the Cheyenne, who were mostly bison hunters, as I recall. So there's a paper by Rick Steckel that looks at heights amongst Native Americans, and it follows pretty well. I mean, those in the Pueblos who lived on corn, are this tall, and the Cheyenne are, very tall. So there's this puzzle. If people were actually healthier in hunting-gathering societies, why bunch together? And it seems to be because of the violence for death. So it could be an additional motive. Right now, yours is sort of an accident, right? I mean, because you want to confine the herd. Aggressive are a nuisance to confine, so you kill them off. So you end up with all these domesticated goats and so on, and that's a good thing, right? But I'm just saying, it would necessarily change, and people argued as well. Hunting-gathering societies were very equal in terms of splitting up the gains compared to once you settled down, income inequality went up. land was not owned equally, and then you had a political hierarchy that was very different. So I'm not sure how much you can do this completely divorced from those things. I mean, you can, if you just kind of abstract from that.
Okay, so a couple of things. I like what you are saying. The defense story, I think I like it. It's interesting. To complete the puzzle, you need to link that with the idea that you will be selecting in a different way.
Right. Yeah.
So that's I think I'm not seeing immediately what would be the link, but there might be a link. Okay, so essentially that once you, for defense purposes, you need to live in a kind of a smaller habitat, then that you switch to a different kind of hunting strategy at the end.
Yeah.
Okay, so you need to see that link in order to generate these changes in the
And the group size
types,
can get bigger. So the size of hunting-gathering societies tended to be relatively small compared to what you got when you had settled agriculture. And in some cases, you sent the hunters out, and they'd come back, and that could be complementary to this process of domestication. Okay. So until you completely domesticate, let's say with cattle, you're sending out hunters to get stuff, and then they bring it back, and that's a complement to settled agriculture, and allows you to get bigger, and overall income went up. It's just that the gains weren't equally distributed.
You mind if I make just a couple?
Yeah, sure.
I mean, I like the way you're thinking. One thing we just want to point out that the model presented in this paper is sort of an all-purpose model of a species that has some aggressive and domestic, and I mean, ultimately, we're thinking about this. There's at least a couple different kinds of animals you want to domesticate. So dogs are quite different than cattle. For example, dogs you're using for protection and hunting maybe even hunting other wild animals that you're not domesticating. And so, whereas when you domesticate for cattle and sheep and so forth, you're domesticating for meat and hides and sustenance, and sometimes work effort with cattle for sure, not for pigs, as far as I know. So there are different kinds of reasons to domesticate different groups. And again, linking, so once you've got the dog, and this is likely to be the case, it's going to be relatively cheap to get cattle and goats and sheep, because cattle, goats, and sheep see dogs as wolves. And there's no doubt about that. And so and the evidence is that dogs come first. The best evidence is that dogs come before the other stuff. Making the model add on. There's a lot of different connections, including political, but also this idea of complementarity. I think is important.
So coming up, so the idea of the wolf dog thing, it's we also, so it's not in this paper. We also develop a model of wolf dog, and essentially there. It's not a change in hunting strategy. What's happened is essentially protection. Essentially. Right. So you start killing the aggressive wolf close to your area because of protection, and that slowly give you kind of more aggressive dogs wipe out of your areas, and then a separation between the population of wild wolf and then something that ends up conversion in a dog, essentially. And then something interesting that you can play in that version is, well, first of all, the mechanism is a little bit different, because you are just, so you are not harvesting this population, you are just killing for protection, so which is something different. And then the second thing is, it's very interesting to see if there is overlap in the levels of aggressiveness between the wild population and the domesticated version. And then depending on how you set up the model, you can end up with situations in which there is overlap and situations in which they completely diverge. Right. So essentially, the most aggressive dog is not even as aggressive as the most docile wolf, essentially. But maybe for other species, you end up in situations that that's not the case, okay? And you also have some incentives there of, at some point you trigger a point in which it's possible that you want to go and wipe out also the wild population too. So essentially, you can have those incentives in this type of models. Which, again, this is something that we is part of the project, but you haven't seen it in this paper. Right? But I think the protection mechanism that you have in mind is more protections of kind of other humans, other groups attacking you. Okay,
Right.
so this is more you are protecting from a wide population of wolves. Essentially.
Yeah.
That's
Scott?
Oh, this is just a very quick kind of aside, but there's this book that's pretty well known, but it's called *Sapiens*. I'm sure you've heard of it, A Brief History of Humankind. And I was reading it a couple weeks ago. It's by Harari, is the last name. But I was just trying to find the specific range for you. But it looks like around page 50 to 65, there's this really nice summary of kind of what we've been discussing about how all this played out.
Okay.
And as well as alluding to a lot of nice examples that you might weave in potentially to the paper, maybe not, and why, for example, hunter-gatherer societies, because they were so much more healthier, still died out, right? So for what it's worth, I found it to be fascinating. It's not an area I know much about, but you might find one or two useful things in there.
Nice.
What's the author name again?
Yeah, the last name is Harari. It's Harari, and it's called 'Sapiens: A Brief History of Humankind.
Cool.
Yes. Yeah,
That's
it's a
very
fun
good.
read regardless.
Yeah.
That's very good. Yeah, so there are a lot of good works out there, not done by economists usually. So essentially, for us, it has been reviewing a lot of literature outside econ and trying to connect, and then essentially trying to our comparative advantage is in those things: property rights, renewable resources, evolutionary economics. What can we bring to the table? No? But I would also like to mention one thing about the domestication process. Is that we are targeting to understand the historical process, because then, so a couple of years ago, we have a very nice presentation about the domestications of Siberian foxes, but that's a very different thing. So the purpose of the experiment was to domesticate the dogs, or to at the very least to try to understand the process of domestication. Or you can get a dog starting with a fox, and that's just picking the docile ones, okay? So then, okay, good, but the historical explanation could be different. And I think it must be different because the speed of the process was completely different. So we are talking about thousands of years, I guess, in historical explanation, and then, I don't know, in less than 15, 30 years, they end up going from a fox to a dog in the Siberian example, okay? So it's, now that we know the process, we know genetics, it's kind of, you can do it at a different scale, no? And to some extent it's happening with essentially chickens, pigs, whatever we eat, it's, that process it's not domestication, but the selection is still around, no? So it's, so yes, any references on the historical process, it's very useful for us because that's what we are targeting, no? Mm-hmm. So it's, yes.
So, when I think of, before reading the paper, I thought of domestication as what happens when we take a horse and start riding it in order to, defend our territories, right? Which is different than the domestication that you're talking about here, which is kind of the culling of aggressive species and making it kind of cheaper to take the products of animals. So, how does, I guess, is there a sequencing in domestication, or are there different types of domestication where there's like this, I don't know, whatever that type of domestication is, where it's like we're taking cows and putting them in fences versus we're riding horses to defend our property. And I'm just wondering, It seems like there would be, once you figure out cows are good in fences, then you see like, oh, cows can also plow fields, so now your agriculture kicks up as well. And I'm wondering about the sequence of this because it is so far away from the things that I read. I was just wondering if you could talk about that.
So I believe that this is a very interesting question. So it's we thought a lot about some potential interesting issues about the sequence. So let me tell you what we thought about it. So the first thing is that we discuss a lot is there are two ways of starting the process. One is that essentially you confine and start selectively killing. That's one option. The other option is that essentially you just capture juveniles. Okay, you capture juveniles and you start your own essentially herd. Essentially, that's a different process. Okay, so in the model essentially we don't distinguish that, but I believe that it's a very interesting It's a very interesting question, okay? And I understand that for different species this could be different, okay? In some cases, I don't think that it's completely clear, the anthropological and genetic evidence, what was the exact process. So we don't know exactly, but at the very least, it would be interesting to explore different mechanisms and essentially figure out, well, if you capture juveniles and you start a new herd, what the process will look like compared to a situation in which you essentially just grab a sample of the population without any distinction for race, for whatever, for age or whatever, sex, and then you bring it. That's your initial population, okay? So that's one thing about the sequence. The only important thing about the sequence is that once you domesticate it once, then our feeling is that this reduces the cost of a new domestication in some cases, okay?
Of the same species, or
of another species, yeah,
okay.
of another species.
Like
No,
you know how to break a cow, so now you know how to.
well, once you have a horse, it's easier to handle cows essentially. So that's well, it went the other way around, okay?
Right.
But essentially, again, so some of these things could happen, especially I think with the dog. So once you have the dog, it's possible that the dog was used in part of the domestication process of other species.
Right,
Okay, there is no. I haven't read any particular evidence about that, but it seems that it seems something plausible. The other thing is once groups get in touch. Okay, so essentially, if you're in touch with a group that already domesticated one species, okay, your incentives to go over kind of rediscover the wheel are very low. Okay, so essentially you can trade. So you can buy the domesticated animal instead of going through the whole process, okay? And that's essentially, I think there is a lot of evidence with the colonization of America and a lot of species we are essentially bring from Europe, and they will run. So some species, well, plants and animals that were domesticated in America, then they were translated to Europe. So that process I think is very, very interesting because it implies trade, implies markets, implies, many other things. And the final comment I would like to mention is all people working on domestication, they distinguish in a very clear way taming an animal and domesticating an animal. They're very different things, okay? So it's taming your dog is one thing, is transforming a wolf to a dog is a very different thing. So the second one is involved evolutionary process, the other one is just beating the thing, so to change the temporary cost, but you're not selecting types essentially, you know.
Right.
So it's a very different thing. I'm not saying that in the process of domestication they did not use taming, but it's a different thing.
Right.
It's a different thing.
Okay, thank you. That helps.
Yep. No, very interesting thing. So it's one of our way to forward is to think more carefully about all these issues connected with the sequence, essentially.
Yeah.
Yep. In this, that's a very important thing, I believe.
Angie?
So, I wonder how much it matters that the wild animal that you're trying to domesticate is smart and the population that's trying to domesticate it is also intelligent. So,
Okay.
I don't know the answer, but a bunch of those are really stupid.
Yep.
But some of them are ridiculously smart. So there's a huge amount of cost associated with the time of what you're talking about. But if you're planful about it, and then you could share it amongst your community.
You're thinking of domestic chickens, wild chickens.
Well, but we can pick whatever we want, right?
Well,
So
then sheep, same thing.
yeah. So, but there are substantially different levels of intelligence amongst things. So I guess my question is more along the line. I mean, a survival instinct will exist in all of them. There's a difference
Sure.
between a planfulness.
Yes.
So I wonder how much it made a difference that you have this community that's gone from I'm just killing things and hunting and gathering to now we all sort of share a collective knowledge. And because we develop intelligence, we can begin to domesticate animals that also are able to strategize.
Okay.
And I don't know the answer because this is not my
I think
area.
It's very interesting. So I talk about this issue with some friends from biology,
Yeah.
and essentially their point I think was very, very strong. It's like a wolf is much smarter than a dog. A dog is stupid, super stupid compared with a wolf. Okay, I'm not. I don't know. I couldn't discuss with them because I don't have the training. But that was her view. Okay, so it's, the reference that you are talking about, Cyan, I also heard this idea that essentially once humans were domesticated, they also became dumb, essentially.
Yeah.
So there is this view. So I don't know if it's correct or incorrect, but that view it's been discussed among evolutionary biologists. Okay, so that is something true. The other thing I believe it's also interesting for us is that for herd animals, you can respect the social structure,
Right.
and then put on the top of that, and then somehow help your domestication process.
Sure, right.
So
And then once, if just you knew that, that's fundamentally different than us as a community knowing.
correct. Yep.
Because then we can duplicate. I mean, we can drastically increase the population once a lot of us are working together to increase cattle
Yep.
in our local communities. So I don't know the model can capture that. I mean, that might be way too complex. But that's what when I see those animals, that's immediately what I think of.
Yes, so I think there are several interesting questions related to that. So the first one is that if you have these animals with this social structure,
Yeah.
is it easier to domesticate than once you put on the top
You're
and
right.
respect the social structure,
just you can
or when you break the structure?
Right.
Because maybe you
And that
need
includes
to
all
break
of us.
the structure. Okay,
Yeah.
so that's I think is an interesting question. Okay, the other thing is that it could be easier for you to control those species because they have a social structure. No.
Well, that's the sheep, right?
No doubt about it. But at the same time, you have to be careful that maybe that's also a consequence of the domestication process, no? Because they were very much more aggressive when they started, no? So essentially, then you transform those animals in more docile ones, and now then you put at the top of this social structure, and then they are easier to control, okay?
Yeah.
And I'm thinking right now that in some sense those things could be even substitute, no? So an animal that doesn't have a social structure that you could put on top, you need to domesticate those animals. You really need to select for many years
Yes.
the really docile ones in order to be able to control them.
Right.
While in some cases in which they have this social structure, it's kind of easier to control them without high degrees of domestications, if you want,
Yeah.
loosely speaking. Okay. So I think there are a lot of ideas that could come from that, from your comment. My feeling is, again, I will keep talking with people from biology. The ones that I talked, they were very strong about this view, and I'm not 100% sure, but that was their view, especially when we're talking about wolves and dogs. So that was their view. Okay, that was their view.
Can I add just a couple
yes,
points
yeah,
on this?
sure.
So one thing we know, and the archaeologists look for this when they look for evidence of domestication, is that for the herd animals, for sure, the age and sex ratio changes dramatically. You do not keep a natural sex ratio. So wild cattle, I'm not saying it's 50-50, but it's going to be a much larger proportion of males. The males behave very differently than the females with young, and they also get big and nasty when they get older. And so the standard thing is you have fewer males in the herd animals, and you keep them relatively young. So that's sort of within her. So remember, our model is just a glob. The population is just a glob. There's no age or sex structure to it. So, but that is so when they find kill sites where there's not many males or things like this, they know now we've got a domestication kill site, not a wild kill site, or we have no old males.
Yeah.
If you have a wild kill site, you're going to see much more
Sure.
different mix of stuff. So, you're still keeping the social structure, especially with the females in these herd animals, which kind of keep the thing together. But the males are kind of coming and going depending on the breeding season, basically. So that's.
How much does the knowledge of the human community, though? I mean, that sounds like knowledge developed in a human community. So I guess that's my question: is how much the knowledge of the human community impacts the entire thing? Because right now they literally kill all the male chickens because they can't produce eggs. So they kill them as chicks. They just wipe them out. Got bad news for you. It's awful.
Right.
So
yeah.
So
historically, I think
we do big kill sites today.
Yeah.
Some farm in God knows where is just wiped out an entire male population.
Yeah. Okay. So.
Right.
So,
Okay.
so I guess that's my question: is how much? Because if you're a hunter-gatherer, you're knowledgeable yourself, but it's a very small group who would have the knowledge.
Yep.
Because there's an advantage, right? Because I need to keep that knowledge to myself because that's how I feed me. Once we live in a community, it changes. Because now I have a choice. Either keep it to myself and I'm the guy you pay to get your whatever, or we share it and then we can collectively share knowledge and build what you're talking about. And I don't know your model can, but I wonder if that's a next step is to think about the intelligence or the knowledge of the human community and how it impacted the selection that's done.
Well, that's interesting. I mean, over time, once you get to the the model, once you get to a domesticated state, you have a different culture that we don't really, and we haven't changed the social structure, the political organization of it. By the time you get X generations and you have a domesticated population, but you're going to have a different set of human skills that go with managing that stuff. And so I think a way to think about this is imagine you're domesticated, you're a culture that has a domesticated set of species, and you're living this new life. On the edge of you, and this is certainly true, you've got hunter-gatherers who are potentially still hunting the domestic ancestor.
Right.
Okay, so
Like the
auroch, which is the ancestor of domestic cattle, it wasn't extinct until the 17th century. Okay, and certainly you go back 1,000 years before that, there were a lot of them that were still hunted occasionally. So they were coexisting for a long time. Obviously, wolves and dogs coexist still. So in many cases, you still have and had for a long time. And so that interaction, so you're thinking, obviously the Native Americans, you think, well, here are these people with domestic cattle coming, they look a lot like bison. They are a lot like bison, actually. What are you going to do? Are you going to, we know what happened, but you can imagine converting over into the domesticated cattle lifestyle. That's essentially what happened, though, is the domestic cattle people conquered the hunting bison people, and it wasn't trading with them much. I mean, some.
Wiping them out.
So they had a different. Both groups had different sets of information about how to interact with essentially the same, not quite, but essentially the same species. So that's I mean, that's a really interesting line. It goes. I mean, it ultimately goes back to the political organization, if you will, of the groups, and that is going to change as you domesticate.
Yep.
For sure. And we haven't.
Sure.
We haven't really think more about that.
So something I can add. So it's to be explicit about what we are doing in the model. So implicitly, so it's from one generation to the other, they are transferring this knowledge essentially. But there is no heterogeneity in the populations. It's not like, well, everybody's transferring the same thing because we are just modeling a group, if you want, okay? But if you start putting, different individuals of the group, it could be easily that only one part of the group innovates, and then, you have to think about what are the incentive of that person. You can even have a potential, essentially, common resource or public good problem, essentially, or even some kind of coordination problem, in the sense that if enough people switch, you want to switch, otherwise you want to stay. So essentially only the groups that can essentially pass that threshold switch to the domestication path, okay? But what we are always doing in the model, and that's the evolutionary component, is they are not like taking into account the full dynamic path, okay? They're not taking into account that, this will generate a domesticated animal, 1,000 years from now. They're just taking into account the per period cost, okay? So that's the evolutionary component. So it's not like a growth model in economics in which you have innovation. In those models, essentially, these are not evolutionary models in the sense that the entrepreneurs are they perfectly foresee the whole path of monopoly rents in the future. They see the cost of innovation and they make a perfect rational decision, okay? I don't think that type of model will be a good type of model for the domestication process. I think most likely they started because, something was better in their common day life, and then this triggered a process, essentially. And indeed, once the process starts in our model, you cannot stop it, but maybe it's something interesting to think about it if there is some shocks or something could happen that can essentially stop the process at some point, for example.
Well, I wonder if you looked at other animals. Look, this is not my area, but to me, those are animals that if I walked to the Bloomington South, they could tell you that those are probably the domesticated animal, right? They'd make a list, even if they didn't understand your model.
Correct.
but there are ones that I wonder why we don't reject, or weird little outliers domesticate. So alligator and that stuff's
Yep.
really popular in the South. They live in pens and are domesticated, but no one would put them up there, I'm assuming. So I wonder if if there is an outlier that was actually rejected, the process was rejected. And I don't know I certainly don't know the
No,
answer.
I can tell you the little things that I know. This is Diamond has a huge discussion in his book about the zebra and why the zebra was
There you
not
go.
domesticated. And then I think there are kind of two views there. One view is that they stress the characteristics of the animals. Some animals, they have some characteristics that allows you to domesticate, and
Yeah.
some other animals, it's impossible, okay?
Sure.
I think that, if I'm not wrong, Diamond is pushing for this idea, okay? Some biologists, I think originally they were also pushing for that idea. In some sense, because we want to stress that there are some social components here, we are kind of pushing for more environmental and social factors, and essentially saying, okay, maybe there are some cases that, of course, it's almost impossible to domesticate, some other cases that are easier, but then the threshold should be determined by cost and benefits, social issues, environment. So that's the interesting thing for somebody
Sure.
with the social science training, okay?
Yeah.
And that's what we are thinking about. And the most important thing from my perspective is also that threshold will change as others domesticate, of course,
Sure.
because then, well, what's the point of domesticating the zebra if somebody else already domesticated the horse? Okay, maybe you can just buy a horse and start the herd of horses rather than trying with this relatively difficult animal to domesticate the zebra. But if you don't have the horse, maybe you keep trying, and at some point you domesticate the zebra.
Yeah.
No? So it's an equilibrium outcome that the zebra was not domesticated and not just a pure characteristic of the zebra, in my view. Okay.
Yeah.
So it's.
Yeah.
But yeah, these are very interesting questions. Very interesting ones.
I mean, if we just pick up on Diamond, so he pushed this idea of innate characteristics, and in the process, he's making comparisons of current domesticates with similar wild species of the same genus or something like that. So comparing domestic cattle to wild bison. Well, that's not the right comparison. You want to compare to wild auroch. They're extinct now. You know, if you look at the structure of these guys, there's and we have some written accounts actually, because they haven't been extinct that long. They were every bit as big, fast, and nasty as bison. Okay, but they were, so I mean, it's really, I think people are moving away from that innate characteristics thing for all those sort of reasons. And if you're in a place, this is sort of the long-run natural resource curse idea that Gustavo was talking. If you're in a place where the hunting and fishing is good, you might just sit there, and then next thing you know, this is guns drip. Next thing you know, the Romans are coming over the hill with their horses and their cattle and their swords and it's everything else, and they're carrying their wheat and food and so on. And there you were. So the cost, once you get to that domesticated event, the cost of domesticating a similar species is really high compared to, and this is where we think the origin of markets and property. This is the legal term chattel comes from the Norman word cattle. And chattel is personal property in law. So this is the origin of property, both real and personal. Once you get, you start to get, we don't talk about that. You start to get the ownership of individuals, and the archaeologists look for fences and corrals and barns and storage places for grain, and you start to get, and this is really, it's a big transformation of human society when you can start to own this wild stuff, and it's easier to own wild stuff when it's nice.
You bet.
You can think of
Chickens are
wild
little
stuff that
They're little.
isn't hostile. I mean,
Yeah.
I'm thinking
Yeah,
of,
yeah.
of salmon in the Pacific Northwest,
Yeah.
where they had property rights.
Yeah.
And Bruce Johnson's work on that's
Yeah.
pretty fascinating.
Yeah.
So they had technological change, and they were also careful not to wipe out, because salmon always returned to where they were born. So you want to control how many escape and get back so they come back again. And so it's an interesting case where you get property rights without domestication.
You're getting economic selection, though. Of some,
Pardon me?
you're getting some economic selection of
Yes.
some sort,
Oh, yeah,
but
they
it's
were
a little
getting-
different process. That's really interesting.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it seems considerable. It has some similarities to this because they had property rights, and some were a lot richer. And actually, Bruce's point is somewhat controversial. He's convinced me, but the reason for potlatching, just giving away wealth like that, was to keep your neighbors from coming after you. So you had the most salmon. So the thing for you to do was to redistribute part of your wealth in these big banquets and parties to prevent them from attacking you.
Huh.
Okay, that's why we have
Cool.
tax-free donations.
But I think that's essentially Bruce's story. But they had strong property rights over where they lived, and because the salmon always came to certain places, some Pacific Northwest tribes were considerably wealthier than others, and to prevent conflict, you'd give away part of your wealth to appease people from attacking you who were
Cool.
less wealthy. One thing I wanted to bring up in your model is, there's always upfront costs, right, to confinement. So you've got a positive discount rate, and one would think that it's interesting, why Asia and the Near East. Is there anything different about discount rates versus the Americas? Because as soon as you have upfront costs and a higher discount rate, you'd never engage in this. So the other thing about domestication is it seems to imply settlement. Instead of going after things, you confine them. And you don't really talk about that so much. You talk about the selectivity, and it's easier to confine more docile than aggressive animals. But confinement itself means settlement, it seems to me.
Yeah.
Correct.
Can I just really quick on that?
Yeah.
Because I'm also looking at figure 1, and it seems that goats, sheep, pigs, and cattle are domesticated in that order, kind of suggesting it might be there might be less upfront costs in domesticating goats than cattle.
Which figure exactly you are looking this?
In your paper,
or in my,
figure 1.
I think it's that one. No?
Yeah, that one.
Yeah.
If I'm interpreting the dates right, but this goes on lease point. Like, is there and it seems across all those regions, it goes goats, then sheep, then pigs, and then cattle are domesticated. So maybe there are fewer costs, but it seems like domesticating a cattle would be more profitable. So this is maybe that's just on lease point about your thoughts on that.
Yeah, good point.
That could be geography.
So
But I mean,
Pigs are pretty
the
big.
simple math of, the higher the discount rate, the higher the cost of confinement, the further in the future you're going to do it, because, so you can.
a couple of things. I totally agree that the discount factor will affect essentially a decision like this, because essentially it works like an investment. No, the issue is that if at some point we want to connect it with some data, I think we will need to target some natural environmental factors, because that's your best alternative. But it could be that there were other things going on. Okay, in terms of the diffusion, if I'm not wrong, I think that the evidence suggests a combination of two things. It's that the groups that were early to the initial sites of domestication, they adopted. And then migration of humans for the places farther away. So that humans were migrating with their own domesticated.
And the goats will go with you.
And
The
that's-
pigs you're carrying.
Exactly. So that's a combination. Maybe it's interesting to start disentangling when is one force, when is the other one, what are the determinants of one force versus the other. So it's indeed, so far, remember I put one of the goals of the project is to understand the spatial diffusion and temporal diffusion. This is the part of the project that is less developed, if you want, okay? So we haven't really thought a lot about what are the determinants, let's say at the theoretical level, to start thinking about, okay? the patterns of temporal and spatial diffusion. Okay, so but I think there are some patterns there, and you can start thinking what were the determinants of the patterns. Okay, so it's unfortunately I cannot be more specific about that. There is some evidence. There are some anthropological evidence on. I think. Let me see if I have this. Is that picture on the? Oh, there. That's, I think, is the expansion of the Neolithic communities in the Mediterranean basin. Yeah. And then I think for those cases, they can distinguish to some extent the migration versus the kind of adoption by essentially nearby groups. Essentially. Nearby groups adopts, and then you learn, and then boom, you adopt. Okay. Of course, it's not perfect, but there is some evidence in that direction. But that's essentially the whole Neolithic package. Okay, so domestication of plants, animals, right. And then different people define the Neolithic package in different ways. But that also implies some social order, some political order, settlement, so on and so forth. Okay, so this is more than pure domestication, but also give you some ideas, okay, of the diffusion. Okay, the diffusion. But I think what you are asking is also interesting. You are asking more about, the diffusion could be different for different species, no? And why, no? So you are wondering why cattle, why pigs?
That's based on Lee's ideas, though. It's the cost, the upfront costs to doing it, right?
Correct. So it's essentially the things that I can tell you there. It's if you want to somehow play around with a little bit with the available data, you would say, well, let's go for environmental factors, and then there are some places, and the environmental factors could be of two types. Okay, one is location specific, so it's a climate, soil, blah blah, or the other thing could be some characteristic of the animals that also play a role. No? And then I would think the most difficult thing from a perspective, the most interesting is, well, how those things are affected also by the social order, the political features. No? So essentially, what you are pushing us to think about it. Okay. So, which I think is very difficult because there the evidence is maybe much more complicated. No?
Sure, yeah.
On the discount factors, I would say.
Also, the other thing I'm thinking about is, if you want to just keep this to domestication of animals, because it's so complementary to selective seed varietals. So that, again, once you get confinement, then you're going to get special seeds. So my question is, which came first? Was it agriculture with certain seeds that then, once you're settled, then the costs of confinement fall, and it's advantageous for you to have cattle if you've got row crops,
right.
And you certainly want to prevent people from coming in, so then you've got, that affects and you mentioned, you have a reference to Henry Smith, but you never use him there in the sense of semi-commons, where crops were private, but the cattle then went on the land that would spread their waste, that would fertilize the land, but then when you have the crops, those would be private. So it has.
So
it would just be interesting.
Do you want to take this one, especially on the timing of domestication of plants versus animals? I think it's not super clear, but maybe you can clarify.
I think it's super clear. I think dogs first. I think we get plants a bit later. But you and the semi-commons may quibble about the term, but the idea is that you have some confined places to keep and potentially feed the animals once you have the crops. But you also have the rise of the common pastures, which is a big thing around here. You get those, you get that kind of structure of institution where you get a settlement with private ownership of grains, buildings, etc., and private ownership of herds. But the herds then graze together on common pastures that are defended collectively. So you get that. Now that's obviously a big organizational, political shift from pure hunter-gatherer.
Right.
Okay, and that's, so we don't have any of that in the model now. The organization of the group is not changing, and that, I think that's sort of a next step. Once you get to that domestication point where you've got, sort of the relatively stable, more or less docile sort of population you can handle, what's the optimal structure of the group, and how's it linked to other species as well. You can start to talk about the rise of these institutions that are kind of things that we're all kind of, in some sense, familiar with in different combinations, of course. But yeah, I think that's really, and it's very. The other thing that's missing here is we know that the settled agriculturists also did some hunting of wild species.
Right.
That were the ancestors of the species they've already domesticated. Okay. And then there were some species that they never seem to have bothered to try to domesticate. The deer family comes to mind, except for reindeer. That's the only deer that really gets domesticated, is the reindeer. So all the elk and moose and other deer are hunted as wild animals and adjacent, and even in common property areas adjacent to where they. And meanwhile, you're still killing wolves. You have your dog, but you're still killing wolves. That's sort of the big thing. People either kill wolves or they keep them as pets and protectors. It's all or none. Until very recently, now that they're kind of these aesthetic creatures, but until very recently that was it. Kill them or bring them into the family.
I'm trying to think if I know of any situations where you domesticated, but then you were gathering. So I know of situations where you had settled agriculture, but you supplemented that not with having your own herds, but hunting. So the Cherokees come to mind.
Sure. Yeah, Native Americans didn't really domesticate
settled agriculture, but they had in their treaty with the U.S. they had access to huge hunting grounds, and they'd go there once or twice a year and hunt buffalo.
And the Native Americans exactly that. They're domesticating a few plants,
right,
and basically zero animals except the dog.
Yeah, that's right.
That is exactly right. So the tribes along the Missouri River were bison hunters, but they had corn and squash and so on.
Yeah, that's right.
So that's actually important that they never got. Maybe it's just. And this is a question. We want to do more with this, but how long does it really take? I mean, if we could have isolated North America for another 1,000 years, would the bison have been domesticated? Or do you need 10,000 more years?
Yeah.
Right. I mean, they were there. It was sort of obvious. But by the time, anyway, what happened is the domestic cattle came first, and we.
Could it be something super simple, like cattle? If I have a group of 30 people, a cattle killing a cow or a cattle is not going to produce waste, or killing something as big as a bison would have more potential waste. Are they about the same size? I don't have.
Yeah, they're literally the range scientists count the same amount of, almost the same impact.
They have the same meat and they have the same.
And it's a little different, but it's.
No.
I mean, so if you look, and I've done
I
this,
don't have a clue.
if you look at the sort of biological carrying capacity of bison, the Great Plains, you get a number, and then if you look at the amount of cattle on that exact same land by 1910, it's the same.
Well,
It's virtually replaced one for one.
I thought cattle didn't move, because they were domesticated, didn't move around as much.
Yeah.
No, I mean, they're fenced differently, they're managed differently, but in terms of the amount of grass that's there, so the amount of grass, it's 20 million bison, this is 20 million cattle. Now, if you bring in,
Really?
if you bring
Bison
in
didn't
lots
take
of stuff.
more food.
Pardon me?
I thought bison needed more food because they were moving around so much and more aggressive.
Well, I mean, it's not exact. I mean, it's not one.
Yeah,
It's pretty close to one. I mean,
well, and now we
yeah.
changed the equation completely, right? So the cattle are kept on probably too little land for the bite, so it's probably a guess.
Yeah, but if people who've gone in and bought ranches and then put bison on, they're basically putting more or less the same number of bison on the land. And interestingly, when they manage, they don't keep old bulls around. It's just,
cover that.
Not good.
Yeah.
Just not
3-4 years, no 20-year-old bull.
Academia would do the same.
At a certain point.
Yeah.
So,
We don't have mandatory.
Upper arm.
Did you ever, I can't remember, did you ever talk about reindeer?
Well,
He mentioned
I mentioned
reindeer,
it, yeah, and
yes.
it's a great case because you've got some domesticated, some wild, and a mix, and different types of domestication. I mean, I think it's something I've looked at a little bit. I think it's something we want to look at in more detail. So I think it's
And it's a relatively late case of
relatively
domestication.
late also. Yeah.
Okay, last word?
Well, I think, I have several pages of comments. I'm sure that Dean also have some comments. This has been very, very useful. So really, thank you very much. It was very productive for us. Thank you very much.